Mitch, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the program.
You are such an iconic writer. You have written books like Tuesdays with Morrie, Have a Little Faith, The Five People You Meet in Heaven. We're going to talk about The Stranger in the Lifeboat today, your latest book. But I wanted to sort of start in your story because we know all of your wonderful works. When did you realize and how did you come to realize that you were such a prolific writer?
Well, prolific is an interesting word because it just means you produce a lot of something. And I was a sports writer, for much of my early career. Before I wrote any books that anybody knows me about, I was a sports writer. And sports writers have to be prolific because they have to write a lot and they have to write sometimes off of a game that you have to send a column before the game is over. You have to send a column after the game is over. You have to send a column after you've talked to the players after the game is over. So sometimes on a single event, I would write 3 or 4 actual columns and have to send them in and all be done in a very short period of time, like within a half an hour. So you learn how to write fast and you learn how to write a lot. But I'm not sure I learned, the prolific part of book writing until after Tuesdays with Morrie. And to be honest, while I appreciate the compliment, I think my publishers would tell you that I am not prolific. By their standards, they would like me to be writing something every year, all years, and I don't do that. It took me 6 years between Tuesdays with Morrie and The Five People You Meet in Heaven, and 3 years between The Five People You Meet in Heaven and For One More Day. And so I'm by publishing standards, I'm a little slow, to be honest.
Sometimes that's better, though. I mean, clearly, what you come up with, the plot lines, the characters, there's such a depth there, and people walk away feeling something. And it takes time for those stories, I think, to come to us. And so I understand that. I mean, I look at your latest book now, The Stranger in the Lifeboat, some really interesting themes there. What for that book, and I'm curious in this process because you mentioned, you had that 6 year gap in between the books you noted there. What inspired the plot line for that book, for this latest book?
Well, I'm glad you asked me what inspired the plot line because a lot of people just assume you come up with the plot and then you figure out what the book's going to be. And there are a lot of writers who do that. I imagine writers who write crime novels or thrillers or things like that. Plot is everything. But for me, I always try to come up with an idea that I want to get across, a lesson that I learned along the way. And then I try to create a story around it. So, for example, The Five People You Meet in Heaven, it wasn't supposed to be about heaven. I didn't sit down and say, let me write about heaven. I said, well, I want to write a story that shows that everybody matters, everybody counts, even people who say I'm a nobody, like my Uncle Eddie, who the book was based on. I'm a nobody, never did anything. That's not true. Everybody affects somebody in some way. Then I ended up creating a whole story about heaven because that ends up being the place where we find out, you meet 5 people from your life and you find out that you had an impact on each one of them in ways that you didn't realize. But the idea wasn't the plot. The idea was everybody counts. For The Stranger in the Lifeboat, the idea was help, the how we ask for help, and how in this world we often think like our prayers aren't being answered if we don't get the help that we ask for exactly when we want it and how we want it. Like we're ordering a deli sandwich, I ordered the roast beef with the Swiss cheese and this it didn't come out. It's been 5 minutes. What's taking so long? But that's not how God works. That's not how the world works. So many times we think our prayers aren't answered, and then 10 years later, you look back and you say, well, that was a really bad thing when it happened. But now that I look back on it, if that hadn't happened, this wouldn't have happened. And I wouldn't have met this person, wouldn't have gotten married, wouldn't have kids. So I guess it was the best thing that could have happened to me, right? We all say that. Well, if it's the best thing that could have happened to you 10 years from now, it is the best thing that could have happened to you now. But now all we do is complain about it. So I wanted to create a story that was about help. And I created this fantastical circumstance because I said, well, where do you need help the most? Like, what's the most dire thing you can think of? And I thought, how about in the middle of the ocean on a life raft when nobody's coming for you and you're running out of food and there's sharks in the water? You need help then, and let me create a story that kind of takes place there.
Well, a couple of things. That is one on the list of most terrifying things that could happen in life. That I think is in the top 3 probably,
Yeah,
right? Being stranded in the water and like you mentioned, sharks, not enough food. You're not sure if anybody's going to find you. So what a way to sort of approach a storyline. But to what you were saying about prayer, oftentimes it's so true. The answer that we often get, the answer to prayer, it may be an answer that we didn't want initially. And I think that's such a important message for us all to remember, and we can all relate to it. I know I've seen that in my life. I'm sure you've seen it in your life. And
right.
so it's exciting to sort of have a book that gets people thinking about those things. I often look at your story too and what you've done. One of the big things outside of the book world is that you and your wife opened an orphanage in Haiti, which is just incredible. And I want to talk about some of the issues in Haiti, but first, let's talk about that orphanage. What was it that led you on that path?
Well, I'd love to say that, I went to Haiti to try to stop the suffering of the children. But the fact is, I went after the earthquake of 2010. I took a pastor down there who said he had this orphanage and he thought it had been destroyed and that the kids had been killed, but he couldn't get any phone calls in or anything. And so I helped arrange a small plane trip that I went down with him on because in my heart I couldn't accept the idea like there was a mountain of rubble somewhere with children underneath it. How could you not do something if somebody came to you with that? And so we went down, and fortunately, the orphanage had not been destroyed. Other things around it had, but it was overrun. And I was so taken with the kids and their attitude and their positivity and their joy, despite the fact that they had nothing. And of course, the circumstance there was so terrible. Just a couple of weeks after the earthquake, people covered in white dust, bodies out in the street, people climbing on mountains of rubble trying to pull out rocks because they thought their loved one might be buried inside. So I began to go back and I brought back people from Detroit, plumbers, roofers, contractors, the like, and we ended up building the first toilets that the place ever had, the first showers, the first kitchen, the first school, and at some point, the pastor, who was in his mid 80s, I kept noticing the kids were still starving. They weren't eating any better, even for all this stuff that we were doing. And so I kind of confronted him on it. I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I don't really have any money to run this place, and I haven't for years, and I'm in my mid 80s." And in one of those moments that you look back on later in your life and you go, what exactly was I thinking? I said, well, I could probably operate this place if you want. I mean, I operate some charities in Detroit. How different could it be? And he basically said, thank you, Jesus. Hallelujah. Here it is, and that was the end of him. And we didn't see him again, but I ended up taking over the operations, which I've now run for, well, January will be 12 years. And
Wow.
I'm there every month. I have 53 children currently who are there. All of our kids have college scholarships waiting for them. So a number of them are already here in the States in college. And then when they graduate, they go back and they work at the orphanage for 2 years in whatever profession that they trained in because they have to give something back. And then hopefully they go into Haitian society and make Haiti a better place. And it takes up the bulk of my existence, to be honest. I know most people know me as a writer, but my average week is consumed a lot more with operating the orphanage. And I'm there every month, and it's the most important thing and most gratifying thing that I do.
I want to pause on that for a minute because you are one of the most successful writers, of our time. And you could be off enjoying that and just writing away and satisfying what your publishers want you to do, right? And obviously you're putting out great books still, but you just said the bulk of your time is spent doing this. And you've been doing this now for 12 years. How has this changed you as a person and changed your life?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I am enjoying it, and I am off enjoying my life. That's how I enjoy my life, and I do write. I write down there, and in fact, the kids were very instrumental in Stranger in the Lifeboat. A lot of them read the early versions of it, and they gave me their editing ideas, a number of which I incorporated in. They were pretty smart.
That's amazing. That's
But
amazing.
in terms of how it changes you, I mean, in every way, first of all, I feel better about myself when I'm there. I sleep better when I'm there, even though I sleep on a 4-inch mattress, and old pillow, and yeah, it's hot all the time. But when you're needed and you're doing something that's needed, I think you sleep better. And uh, the way it changes you is that, when you come back from the monthly visit there, so much of what we're wrapped up in here in America just seems silly, and seems, not worth the effort it takes to get angry over it, or get passionate over it, or get in arguments over it. And so it helps me with perspective. I would say, if I'm going to spend an hour arguing over who's running for Senate in some place, or an hour trying to find diesel so that we can get our generator turned on so that we can have electricity, because we don't have electricity 12 hours a day, and that means no lights or no fans, the kids can't study, and I got to find a way that we can get some fuel. I'm going to spend the hour on that and not on some political argument. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing.
And that's so important. I think we're all so consumed in America with things that, not that they all don't matter, but things that are far less important than obviously the struggles that people are facing, the things that are happening, there. And, for me, I'm a Christian. For me, I believe serving others is such an essential and an important thing. And that I love what you said about the way that you live your life, that you are enjoying your life doing this. I think a lot of people who don't understand sort of that call that people have over their lives, that they would sort of feel like, oh, well, this is a burden, but it's not. It's actually giving you the fuel to live your life the way you feel you were called to. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I learned that lesson very fortunately earlier in my life when I was 37, and I was visiting my old professor Morrie Schwartz, who became the Morrie of Tuesdays with Morrie, the book that I wrote about our visits. And he was dying from Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, and people would come to try to cheer him up, and they'd always have photos, and they'd have a plan, and they'd have a thing, and the door would close, and an hour later they'd come out and they'd be crying, but they'd be crying about like their job or their love life or their divorce or whatever. And they would say, "Well, I don't know what happened. I went in to try to cheer him up, but after a few minutes, he started asking me questions. So I started telling him, and then he started really asking me questions. I started really telling him, and the next thing I was crying. And I wanted to try to comfort him, and he ended up comforting me. And I went to him. I said, "I don't get it. You're the one who's dying. You're the one who could have the sympathy. Why are you spending time trying to help other people?" And he said to me, "Mitch, why would I ever take from people like that? Taking just makes me feel like I'm dying. Giving makes me feel like I'm living."
Wow.
And that's a profound sentence. And I never forgot that. And I can still see the day that he told me that. And I realized, like, he's 78. He can't move. He needs to be carried from place to place. But the thing that makes him feel alive is when he's giving. And all the stuff he has and everything that he owns or everything he accomplishes is of no use to him. But he can still give, so he feels alive. And I feel the same way. I'm never more alive than when I'm down at the orphanage, because that's when I'm needed the most.
Well, let's talk about Haiti a little bit. Obviously, everyone knows what's going on there. There's a very difficult situation on the ground in Haiti unfolding. You have the Christian missionaries who were abducted, and that's an ongoing situation there. And I think there are a lot of people out there who maybe are pausing and are saying, well, should we go down and help still? Should we do the things we've been doing? There are all sorts of different schools of thought. Many people are still serving there, obviously. But what's your message in light of the fact that you said yourself you're down there frequently, and this is not an easy situation? What would you say to those who are sort of on the fence, wondering should they continue?
Well, hmm, you know, nothing good is very easy, and the good that needs to be done there is challenged all the time. Um, but I go every month and find ways to make it safe. I think you have to be very careful where you travel. The missionaries who were captured were in a terrible, terrible area, known for gang trouble. Um, you have to be very, very careful about where you travel. You can't just go down and say, well, let's go out to eat or let's go here. You have to accept the fact that, basically you're going to go to where you're going to help and you're going to stay there. I never leave the orphanage. I never leave the grounds. We go straight from the airport to the orphanage. We stay there until we're done, back to the orphanage to the airport. Sadly, our kids haven't left in almost 2 years. Between
Wow.
COVID and the gangs, there's it's just not safe outside. So you have to accept that there's certain things that are just going to be limited, but the need grows with these dangers. It doesn't dissipate. And so if you're there to try to help the need, well, the need is more than there ever was before. So I can't tell people what kind of risks to take. That's not for me to say, but I can say that the more dangerous it gets for us, the more serious it gets for the kids and the people who need the help.
Yeah, I mean, walking away at a time when there's so much need. I think that's the part of this too. The reminder for all of us who may not, and there are plenty of people in this country, as you know, you run charities here in the country dealing with poverty and homelessness and other issues. There are people in need here, but the need there and the structural issues are very different. And I think for a lot of us, we're not used to it. We don't understand it because most of us have not faced it, and so this is an increasing problem, and it's incredible that you guys are there. And I wanted to go back to something you said, that when these children at the orphanage, they come here, they're trained, they go to college, they go back, and the goal is for them to help rebuild Haiti, right, to be part of society there. That was something that you
Yeah.
said, correct?
Yeah. We want our kids to, they're not coming to America. They're not here there's enough Haitians who have come to America for a better life. We're trying to give them a better life in Haiti, and we want one day I want one of our kids to be the president of that country, and because there's a history of people only being put into power there because they had the right connections and they played the game, and I'd love for one of our kids one day to become president or a high ranking official, and they say, well, you must know somebody or you must have been born with a silver spoon or whatever, and they say, no, I grew up in an orphanage. And to see those possibilities. And we encourage our kids that that's what they can do at any point with their lives if they want to.
I wanted to also talk with you about Chica. Seeing the story of you and your wife adopting Chica and what she went through. For those who don't know, she had an inoperable brain tumor. You adopted her. You formed this amazing family with her, and you have a book, Finding Chica, that is very, very touching and personal. What led you to share the story, and I know you've shared this over the years, about Chica and what she faced and what she went through so openly?
Well, you know, Finding Chica and The Stranger in the Lifeboat are actually kind of bookend books. So I wrote Finding Chica in pain, the pain that any parent or loved one will go through if they lose a child. And I needed to do something with that pain. And I wrote that book. Basically, it's in the second person. It's me talking to her the whole book long. She right on the very first page, she comes back. So you already know she dies, but she comes back and sits right where I am here right now, next to me as she always did in the office. She would color while I would write, and she starts talking to me. She says, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Well, I'm writing a book." And she says, "Well, why don't you write a book about me?" Which would be something that Chica would say actually, and the whole book is me just sort of talking to her. That was really written in a lot of agony. A couple years later, when I had some perspective, I was able to write The Stranger in the Lifeboat, which is really about help. It's really about, what we do when we cry out for help. And, as I said before, so in this case, in Stranger in the Lifeboat, there are these people who, survived this explosion on a luxury yacht, and there's 10 of them, and they're in this boat, and they're out there for 3 days, the lifeboat, nobody's coming for them, food and water is drying up, they see sharks in the water, it's as dire as it can be, and they're calling out for help in their own ways, and then they see this body floating in the water, and they pull it into the raft, and it's this young guy, nondescript, average looking guy, nothing special about him, and they start peppering him with questions and saying, who are you? Where are you? And he doesn't answer anything. So finally, one of the passengers says, "Well, thank the Lord, we found you." And he says, "I am the Lord." And this becomes the premise of the book, as these 10 people who have been crying out for help, nonetheless refuse to believe that this guy could be their help because he doesn't look the part. and he doesn't act the part. He falls asleep a lot. He gets hungry. He gets thirsty. He looks like a guy who rents surfboards for a living. And so they just don't believe he is who he says he is. And they say, well, if you're God, what are you doing here? And he says, well, haven't you been calling me? And they say, oh, right. So I guess you're going to save us. And he says, well, I can only save you if everyone in this boat believes I am who I say I am at the same time. And all of the challenges of believing in him or believing what he says, despite all this danger and despite the evidence opposite, all the questions that they end up asking him is basically me coming out of the anger that I had when Chica died and the resentment that I had towards God and the universe when Chica died and my shaken belief when Chica died that how can there be a benevolent God in the world that isn't benevolent to a 7-year-old?
Mm.
Stranger in the Lifeboat is me coming to terms with all of that. And so at some point, these passengers all end up asking God some question or another that I wanted to ask, and probably that you would ask if you got God on this podcast instead of me, which would be much more interesting. And things like, well, do you answer our prayers? And this character says, well, I answer every prayer, but sometimes the answer is no,
Mm.
which is something that I had to learn. Or, of course, the biggest question, why do people have to die? And there's a moment where the protagonist of the book, his name is Benji, he lost his wife, but he's just a substitute for me having lost Chica and my wife having lost Chica. And he says, why did you take my wife? Why did my wife have to die? And the answer that comes is when people die on earth, people are always saying, why did God take them? Maybe a better question would be, why did God give them to us? What did we do to warrant their love, their affection, all their sweetness, all those great memories? Didn't you have that, he says, with your wife? And the character says, yeah, every day, like I had it with Chica every day. And the God character says, well, those memories, they're a gift, but the absence of those is not a punishment. I'm not cruel. I'm not here to be cruel. I know that you cry when your loved ones leave this earth, but I can assure you they're not crying. And for me, while I wrote that as part of a novel, that was me finally coming to terms with losing Chica. It was like the end of the Finding Chica book was actually written in the end of The Stranger in the Lifeboat, when I could finally get to a point where I said, you know what? My wife and I were in our mid-50s, and we were blessed with this child. For 2 years, we got to see what it was like to have a family like that because we never had children of our own, even though we got 53 orphans that we take care of. A child in your own house at the foot of your bed, waking you up, where's breakfast, let's go play in the snow, those kinds of things. It was beautiful. It was beyond words. And to have that was God answering a prayer from 15 years ago. And I should say, what did I do to deserve that? Who am I to get that to happen to me in my mid 50s? And once I was able to sort of look at it that way, I didn't hurt so much. And it's my hope that The Stranger in the Lifeboat is kind of a healing book for other people as well. I know that's a rather long answer to your
No,
question,
that was a
but
that was a great answer because my big question was what Chica taught you and what that journey taught you, and you
that's
you
it.
answered that beautifully just now and how you described that, because the pain that you went through is the pain so many have, the questions of why was this person healed and this person wasn't. I mean, there's so many questions that we have in life, and they can breed that anger and that resentment and that frustration, but coming out on the other side of that and finding that healing, those bookends, those books that you put together and wrote, and the way that your latest book addresses that is so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I really appreciate you coming on CBN today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Thank you.